This is question number 12 on QZ6. If a yield curve looks like the one shown in the diagram to the right, so this yield curve slopes up and then slopes down. What is the market predicting about the movement of future short-term interest rates? So we learned the liquidity, we learned three models, right? We can use to explain the term structure of interest rate or the yield curve, which is the expectations theory and segmented market theory, and then finally the liquidity premium theory. Among the three, the last one, liquidity premium theory, is the most promising because this model, this theory can explain all three empirical facts we know about yield curve. So if we go to our lecture slides, um, the three empirical facts are summarized in the slides as the interest rates on bonds of different maturities move together over time, and when short-term interest rates are low, yield curves are more likely to have an upward slope, and it's the other way around when the short-term interest rates are high. And finally, yield curves almost always slope upward. So in this case, the yield curve first slopes upward, and then after some maturity, and it began to slope downward. So this means that the future expected short-term, if you look at the relationship between the long-term interest rate and the short-term interest rate, we can see that the long-term interest rate is an average of the short-term interest rates. Short-term here include the current one and expected future short-term interest rates. It's an average of it, and then plus a liquidity premium. So liquidity premium here is always positive. Um, so in this case, the long-term interest rate or yield curve slopes upward. So this has two possibilities actually. First is that the future expected interest rates will rise. Hence, due to the first term here, the long term or the medium term should be, because the long term is over here, it's actually down, it's lower than the short term. It's still higher, but it's relative to the medium term, it's lower than the medium term interest rate. Right? That's what this shapes here suggests. Um, so two possibilities. One is that the higher medium term interest rate is driven by the first term. So that if that's the case, then the medium term, the short term expected interest rates are expected to rise. So that's just one possibility. Another one is that this term doesn't change much, but the higher long-term or medium-term interest rate, as reflected by this upper sloping portion of the yield curve, is driven by the second term here, which is the liquidity premium. So that means the medium-term expected short for the medium-term, long-term, for the medium-term interest rate, the expected short-term interest rates do not necessarily have to increase, right? Because the second term could also make the medium-term interest rate to be higher than the short-term interest rate. Um, so that's both possibilities could drive this upper sloping portion of the yield curve. But then for the longer term interest rate, it began to fall relative to the intermediate or medium term interest rate. And this must be driven by, because it cannot be driven by this liquidity premium, right? Because this term is always positive. So the fall of the long-term interest rate must be driven by the fall of the long-term fall of the future expected short-term interest rate. But that future is relatively in the long distant future relative to this portion, which is the medium future, medium distant future. So that's the only possibility. And the fall of those future expected short-term interest rates have to be so significant that it will dominate. So this decrease of the first term will dominate this liquidity premium. Hence, the long-term interest rate will start to fall. So that is the possibility here. And then we look for the answer which can match our discussion so far. The market is predicting that short-term interest rates will, based on our discussion, will likely rise and then fall. That's one possibility. Will increase in the near term and then decrease in the long run. But we said there could be some other possibilities, like it might stay constant. Yeah, because the second term here could also drive an increase of the medium term interest rate, right? So that's also a possibility. But let's check whether any other choice here can give us a better answer than this one. We know this one is possibility, increase in the near term and then decrease in the long term. And first one, obviously, that's not right because the long run, in the long term, we know the short-term interest rates must, is this short-term expected interest rate must decrease, but here it says increase, slowly fall over the next 30 years. This is also not so likely because otherwise, if it's a slowly fall, then then it suggests that the second liquidity premium this term, the second term here, might dominate the first term because the fall of the expected future short-term interest rate are slow. So that seems to suggest that the second term will dominate, but that's not consistent with this um, with the fall of the interest rate here. So that's also not possible, not likely. And then remain relatively constant over the next 30 years. That's not right, right? Because we know that it has to decrease at least in the long term. So we choose the third one. What might the yield curve indicate about the market's predictions for the inflation rate in the future? So far, all this yield we're talking about is the nominal yield. And then for the nominal yield, if we can make assumption that the real yield or real interest rate stays relatively constant, then the inflation rate should match the change in the nominal interest rate or nominal yield. And then the market predictions indicate that inflation will first rise, increase in the near term, and then decrease in the long term. So the change in the inflation rate, the choices here are the same as the choices here. So relatively speaking, the last one increased in the near term and then decreased in the long run seems to be the most likely case because the change in the inflation largely should also match the change in the nominal interest rate. And this is what happens to the nominal interest rate. And then that's the most likely case. So now let's check our answer. 100% right.